This is Today as It Happened. Good Thursday evening to you. I'm Liz Landers here with your chronological look at the biggest events and stories of the day. From senators grilling HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on Capitol Hill to a meeting of world leaders in Paris to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine. But first, this morning, we took a look at some of our other top headlines of the day.
Iconic Italian designer Giorgio Armani has died. That's according to his fashion house. Armani was one of the most recognizable names and faces in the global fashion industry. His style of understated elegance helped him build his multi-billion-dollar fashion empire that's lasted over 5 decades. Armani missed Milan Fashion Week in June for the first time as he recovered from an undisclosed illness. Giorgio Armani was 91. President Trump is urging the Supreme Court to step into the fray over his emergency tariffs. His request Wednesday asks the justices to overturn a lower court ruling that found his administration acted unlawfully by imposing many of his sweeping import taxes. The case once again raises fundamental questions for the court about a president's power to act unilaterally and without explicit authority from Congress. Right now in Paris, a summit of the Coalition of the Willing is taking place, where leaders from European Union nations are meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss the war and support for Ukraine. President Donald Trump is expected to join the summit by phone at some point. Scripps News international correspondent Ross Cullen is in Paris with more. And Ross, is there anything new coming from this particular meeting of the coalition?
Well, Thursday saw another gathering of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, Ukraine's Western allies, countries across Europe, and also nations like Canada, Japan, Australia, meeting here at the Élysée Palace, the French presidential office and residence. Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy, was present here in the French capital for this particular meeting to be able to ensure close coordination between the Trump administration and the Coalition of the Willing, particularly when it comes to security guarantees. We heard from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, confirming that some 26 nations have agreed to deploy troops inside Ukraine the day after any peace agreement is signed. There was also a call that was held on Thursday between allies here in Paris and Donald Trump via video link with the US leader to keep him updated on the latest on security guarantees and ensure that there will be US participation in providing those guarantees to Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron saying that there should be a definition of the US position in the coming days. Also, an agreement between Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump to increase sanctions on Moscow should Russia not make moves towards holding that much discussed bilateral summit between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. Certainly, the European allies would want to see movement from the Kremlin in that direction in the coming days.
Ross Cullen live in Paris for us. Thank you so much.
Coming up on Today as It Happened.
You're evading the question.
No, I'm asking the questions here,
You're
Mr.
evading
Kennedy.
that question.
I'm asking the questions,
I
Mr.
asked you a
Kennedy.
question.
I'm asking the questions for Mr. Kennedy.
Welcome back to Today as It Happened. Let's check back in on our daily briefing of today's top stories.
I'm not taking them away from people, Senator.
It takes it away if you can't get it from your pharmacist.
Well, most Americans are going to be able to get it from their pharmacy for free. Most Americans will be able to get it from their pharmacy for free.
The question is everyone who wants it. That was your promise,
No, I
Mr. Kennedy,
didn't.
not
I never
mine.
promised that I was going to
You
recommend
didn't
products with which there is no indication.
You corrupt. President Trump got $3 million. Every Republican got corporate PAC money for the pharmaceutical industry. Democrats as well. Everybody is corrupt, but you? Is that what we're looking at? I don't think so. And I think the issue now...
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Secretary Kennedy, when someone presents you with information that does not fit
I did not blame that shooting. I have no idea whether... I have no idea, and I never said that. You're making it up. You're twisting. Yeah, you are.
Secretary
you are being
Kennedy,
dishonest right now.
If you want to talk about mental health and gun violence in this country, if you want to talk about mental health and gun violence in this country, we should be talking about that, because that's what the
Let's
parents
talk then,
of
Senator.
enunciation.
You are a hazard to the health of the American people. I think that you ought to resign.
An email from a physician friend of mine. Hey, Bill, I'm not even sure what I'm asking you, but we're all confused and concerned about who can get the COVID vaccine. I would say effectively we're denying people vaccine.
Senator Cantwell.
You're wrong.
All right, that was it. You were listening to the Senate Finance Committee hearing holding RFK Jr. on the hot seat. Of course, this comes just days after the CDC director, Susan Menarez, was let go. She had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal earlier today outlining some of the reasons that she believes that she was ultimately fired and some of the big challenges facing both the CDC and public health officials. A lot of focus today on the COVID vaccine, mainly its availability after new guidelines that only those 65 and over or those with a pre-existing condition should be eligible for the shot. A lot of questions as well about medical research, the studies that were ultimately driving recommendations for vaccines in this country, as well as specifically vaccines for children. We have had Steph Liebergen, who's in Washington, has been on Capitol Hill for us watching this hearing. She was in the committee hearing room for a number of hours. As we said, this was a 3-hour hearing. I believe Steph is with us now. She just got out of that hearing room. Steph, if you're with us, tell us about your big takeaways.
Hey, Andrew. Right, just got out of the hearing. It was pretty much 3 hours straight through with Kennedy. There was a short 5-minute break there. And the hearing, was a lot of what I would have expected. The Democrats with a lot of more fiery interactions, fiery back and forth with Secretary Kennedy. And the secretary even at a couple times telling some Democratic senators that they're just making stuff up. So there was a lot of disagreement, sometimes on just basic facts and on kind of, what the basic ground rules were or the, base data. Some disagreements on that, and I think that really contributed to a lot of the fiery moments that we saw from some members on the Democratic side especially, but even some tough questions from Republicans. There were a lot of eyes on Senator Cassidy, who's a member of the Senate Finance Committee, but is also the chair of the Senate Help Committee, which was another crucial one that Kennedy needed to go through before his confirmation as HHS Secretary. So I think there were a lot of eyes on Kennedy, who spent most of the time in the hearing room. For people who've never attended a hearing like this before, all of the senators aren't necessarily in the room throughout the entire 3 hours. They come and go, pop in for their questions, but Cassidy, especially for, I would say, at least the first half of this hearing, he was in the room the whole time. He was listening intently to his colleagues and the questions they were asking and the answers that Secretary Kennedy was giving. So it was kind of interesting to keep my eye on him throughout the hearing as he was very interested in what Kennedy had to say and what his colleagues were asking as well, Andrew.
Yeah, so Cassidy was interesting. He's a Republican who ultimately was the vote that helped put RFK Jr. over the finish line to ultimately get his confirmation. Today we heard him talking about how he thinks Trump should get a medal or Nobel Peace Prize, I should say, for that mRNA vaccine, ultimately leading to COVID vaccines. Talk to us a little bit about how much Trump's work with getting COVID vaccines done in a timely manner was a topic today, squared with some of what we've heard from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the past and today on his views of vaccinations.
There were a number of senators who went after this line of questioning specifically, asking about whether Kennedy supported Operation Warp Speed, which is what President Trump used to try to get that COVID vaccine developed so quickly in the early months of the pandemic. And Kennedy said repeatedly when he was asked that he did support Operation Warp Speed, and it's important for people to realize when we talk about this and we talk about the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer COVID vaccine was the very first mRNA vaccine to get full FDA approval. And so that's why there is this direct connection between Operation Warp Speed and the COVID vaccine development and the mRNA vaccines, because of the secretary earlier last month now in August canceling $500 million worth of contracts related to mRNA vaccine research. So that's kind of the line between all of those elements and why we saw that come up so many times today in the hearing. And Kennedy was it was some of the fiery moments, especially with the Democrats on the committee talking about Operation Warp Speed and whether that was something that he supported. But Kennedy, I heard him a few times in this hearing say that it was that the COVID vaccine was the right vaccine at the time for the virus, kind of giving a nod to the fact that the COVID vaccine has mutated multiple times, and as we've all heard about the different mutations, some have been spreading more easily or have gotten more headlines than others. That seemed to be kind of what the secretary was relying on, and how he could kind of square support for Operation Warp Speed and support for that initial COVID vaccine, but then also kind of still keep himself behind the pullback of those mRNA vaccine research contracts and the pullback of those $500 million contracts that were canceled last month.
And Steph, another big topic was Dr. Susan Menarez, the CDC director, for just a number of days, I think it was less than a month, just dismissed. She wrote in the Wall Street Journal today that in part it had to do with a conversation in late August about her unwillingness to blanketly sign off on some vaccine recommendations. What did Secretary Kennedy have to say in response to that today?
Secretary Kennedy basically says that Menarez is lying and says that he did not ask her to rubber stamp this, any sort of upcoming or expected vaccine recommendations or vaccine changes. Again, this is one of those storylines that we saw come up multiple times in this hearing. The secretary was asked about that, and he said no. He said flatly no, he had not asked her to rubber stamp any sort of vaccine recommendations. However, we got just in the last couple rounds of questionings, we saw probably in the last 30 minutes, another member, I believe it was Ben Ray Lujan, from the Democratic side, asked if Secretary Kennedy asked Menarez to fire multiple career CDC officials. And to that, the secretary said yes, that he did ask her to fire some career officials. That was another part of kind of what led to her ouster as the head of the CDC. And to that part, Kennedy said, yes, he did ask her, but he, multiple times denied asking her to rubber stamp vaccine approvals. But I'll be curious to see, and this is one of those little insider things that most people probably don't look at, is after a hearing like this, senators are allowed to submit questions for the record, and then the secretary will be allowed to submit written answers to all of those. One of the questions for the record that Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican on this committee, plans to ask Secretary Kennedy is how he went from, in less than a month, supporting Menarez as the CDC director and thinking that, she was a trustworthy person. That was a question that apparently Secretary Kennedy says he asked Menarez if she was trustworthy. According to the secretary, Menarez blankly said no when asked that question. So Senator Tillis plans to ask, as a written question for the record, Secretary Kennedy to better explain how he went from completely supporting her as a CDC director to firing her and pushing her out in less than a month. So even some Republicans certainly questioning how all of that came to be and what exactly happened behind closed doors and what conversations were and weren't had that led to her getting pushed out.
Yeah, and Steph, one of the notable moments came from Democratic Senator Cantwell. That was one of the more fiery exchanges with Secretary Kennedy in the earlier moments of this hearing. Let's play that, and we'll get some reaction on the other side.
Sir, you're a charlatan. That's what you are. You're the ones who conflate chronic disease with the need for vaccines. The history on vaccines is very clear. This is the 20th century. That's how many people had vaccines and had illnesses. This is the 21st century. This is the decrease, 99% down to 100%. This is what was delivered with vaccines, and you don't want to support that. You don't want to support that evidence.
So the quality of longstanding medical research was sort of at the heart of a number of questions, specifically from the Democratic side today. Were there any moments that you think sort of stuck out, especially when you talk about any potential daylight between where President Trump is as the sort of the one who is taking responsibility for Operation Warp Speed versus where Secretary Kennedy is as somebody who has been a longtime skeptic of the efficacy of vaccines?
I think, vaccines came up a lot throughout this hearing, and at the end it was with Senator Marshall that the secretary said, I'm not anti-vaccine, I'm pro-medicine. So there's certainly, I think, at the heart of the issue, at the heart of the disagreement between the very, pro-vaccine members, especially on the Democratic side, is there's just a disagreement about what qualifies as reliable data, as reliable science. The secretary has said in videos he put out on social media, in a recent op-ed he put out this week, that he believes he's restoring the trust in the CDC. But I think for people that oppose a lot of these actions he's done since he took over HHS is that they argue that he is inserting the doubt into the CDC, that he is inserting the doubt into the vaccine schedules that have long been, used, and that, thousands of doctors have supported for years. There was an interesting moment with Senator Bernie Sanders where he was asking about the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics and their support for the vaccine schedule that the country has had for quite some time now. And the secretary mentioned a couple names of people that he was relying on for sources as why he is potentially recommending changes or why he potentially supports changes to the vaccine schedule, especially for kids. And Senator Sanders mentioned he's like, that he's relying on those, big medical associations, tens of thousands of doctors versus Secretary Kennedy relying on a handful of folks that he is listening to within HHS and people that he has as advisors. So there's a disconnect. There's definitely a difference, I think, in kind of who people are going to for reliable science, who is who is considered a quality piece of research, a quality study or paper that is put out. A lot of disagreements on kind of some of those basics, and if you can't agree on those basics, it's hard to find agreement on the big issue that they're trying to get to, and that's something that we saw come up, I think, over and over again in this hearing, Andrew.
Yeah, and it is often hard for us to sort of pick out the moments that may or may not resonate with a wider swath of the country. We will see if anything from today did. Washington correspondent Steph Liebrian up on Capitol Hill for us. Steph, thank you for the update.
Up next on Today As It Happened.
More houses are on the market nationwide, but who's buying them? I'm Holly Furfer, looking at what's trending in real estate.
You're watching Today As It Happened, Scripps News' rundown of the biggest events and stories of the day. Let's jump right in.
According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, our electricity bills are increasing more than twice as fast as the rate of inflation. In many places, they've jumped about 5.5% compared to last year. And in Maine and New Jersey, people are paying nearly 25% more for electricity this year. Research shows about 1 in 6 households are behind on their energy bills. Experts say huge data centers fueling the artificial intelligence boom are partly to blame for the increases. And the results of a new survey show it's about to get more costly to get health insurance through your job. According to the consulting firm Mercer, workers can expect a 6 to 7% hike in premiums next year. That's the biggest increase in nearly 15 years. Some companies say they'll try to limit those increases, but that could mean higher deductibles and out-of-pocket costs.
Small investors are making up a larger share of home purchases this year, and signs of a more balanced market could mean an opening for the average consumer.
This property has 4 bedrooms.
Just ask realtors, and they'll tell you the housing market is making some shifts.
So that inventory over the last 3.5 years has jumped up, and to now we have real inventory.
Jeff Lichtenstein owns Ecofine Properties in South Florida.
So you have a lot of people right now who are selling, whether it's land or homes, who are willing to deal.
Inventory is going up, but home prices and mortgage rates are still high, sidelining many would-be first-time home buyers.
All you can do is save, and even then it may not be enough.
Investors are stepping in. A study from Cotality, a firm that tracks property information and analytics, found that in January, investors accounted for 32% of single-family home purchases nationwide, dropping to 29% in June, which is still a record high. But those investors might not be what you're imagining. Small investors, those owning less than 10 properties, are the most common, making up 14% of purchases. Medium-sized investors owning less than 100 properties make up 10%.
The reason that the small investors are thriving is that they're more agile in this market, and they don't need to make as big of a profit center as some of the larger ones.
Large and mega investors collectively account for 5% of purchases, according to Cotality's data.
Some of the larger builders, larger investors want to get a certain return on their money, or they may have problems with crews because of the deportations and some of that going on.
Lichtenstein said the market is seeing more must-sell homeowners who need to sell for financial or personal reasons. But average consumers might not need to wait for interest rates to go down.
When your interest rates are where they are right now, it gives the buyer a lot more bargaining power when they are going in and making an offer.
Experts tell us the shifts are a sign of a more balanced market to come.
I think we'll have a good 2026 because of all these factors coming into play.
According to Redfin, there are 36% more sellers than buyers, a sign of a frozen market. The good news, mortgage rates are falling, and that could bring more buyers and sellers to the market. Holly Furfer, Scripps News Group.
Coming up on Today As It Happened.
Florida Department of Health, in partnership with the governor, is going to be working to end all vaccine mandates in Florida law. All.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. I'm Liz Landers here with your daily rundown of today's top stories.
Well, vaccine policy is becoming more divided across the country. Just look at that hearing we were just covering with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, some states are pulling back from federal guidance, and others are even going further to relax requirements. Even medical organizations aren't all on the same page. Business and tech correspondent Maura Barrett joins me now live. And Maura, how are states taking this into their own hands?
Well, it's just becoming increasingly confusing looking at these state-by-state considerations as they pull away from federal guidance, Andrew. But the big development is this Western State Alliance that was announced on Wednesday. The governors of California, Washington, and Oregon releasing a statement saying that they're basically going to take this into their own hands. They're considering buying vaccines on their own and distributing them. This has been a conversation that various other states have floated as well, but you heard, you put a little bit of sound just before I came on from Washington Senator Maria Cantwell, and she very directly said to Secretary Kennedy that he's throwing away the science and technology that has made America the leader that has saved, and she quoted there the first Trump administration Surgeon General saying that they saved millions of lives with vaccines. And so she said, if you want the Northwest to continue to lead on all innovation and all healthy people, she said, okay, we'll do that, but that it's a sad statement for the rest of America and America's leadership on technology. And so really pointed statements there as we wait to learn more from this Western Alliance. They said they're forming this public health group to provide, quote, credible information on vaccine safety in response to this turmoil that we've seen with the Trump administration and HHS. And they went on to say that if the CDC becomes a political tool that increasingly peddles ideology instead of science, that there will be severe consequences. So a pretty intense warning there. And I should note that this announcement is a big shift from the federal vaccine recommendation system that's been in place for decades. It actually changes up, obviously, what we've been following for the last several decades and is reminiscent of how there were so many state-by-state approaches back when the COVID-19 pandemic began. I actually just got off the phone with a source who pointed out if this is what we're seeing in the public health sector and states are pulling away and going to be issuing their own guidance, what's to say that we're not going to see that in other industries as other agencies under the Trump administration do the same types of things in terms of pulling back, not looking at the science. It's a conversation we've been having across a variety of agencies in terms of cuts in funding. And so that's an interesting prediction, especially when we are heading into, flu and COVID season this fall as people are looking to get their vaccines. And so the West Coast Alliance said that they will announce in coming weeks firmer guidelines for the residents of their states as they consult with nationally respected affected public health information, Andrew.
And more, the other state making news yesterday was Florida. The Surgeon General there announcing a shift away from all vaccine mandates. How are parents and doctors responding to that?
Yeah, this was an interesting announcement, but obviously Florida likes to make a statement, especially when it comes to public health. The state surgeon general equated vaccine requirements to slavery, which was an interesting comparison in terms of the requirements for children going into schools. And this is a retreat from a public health practice dating back into the 19th century. So that's a very marked shift here. I want you to hear some of the state surgeon general's reasoning in his announcement yesterday.
Florida Department of Health, in partnership with the governor, is going to be working to end all vaccine mandates in Florida law. All of them. All of them. Your body is a gift from God. What you put into your body, is because of your relationship with your body and your God. I don't have that right. Government does not have that right.
A very energetic announcement from a state surgeon general who, I should note, is Harvard educated but is calling religion into medical decisions. And you heard cheers and applause from supporters of the move in the room. But for a quick reality check, I want to show you a poll that was recently conducted among both parents across the country and then specifically looking at Florida, because it found that 81% of parents actually support a requirement for vaccines for both measles and polio specifically in schools, with some exceptions. And so the 81% number is national. And then when you look at Florida, the support is actually just a little bit higher that public schools should be requiring those vaccines. And so this decision by the state surgeon general, with support of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, is a very hard pivot from what parents say that they want in terms of protecting their students. Now, we saw the pushback in that fiery hearing this morning that just wrapped with Secretary Kennedy, and we're seeing the same kind of pushback from the medical community. The big concern here is that if kids aren't getting the necessary vaccines, as a lot of medical organizations recommend, that RFK Jr. is endangering public lives. The same goes for those Florida officials as well. The medical community's concern is the lack of herd immunity and that ripple effect that could come if kids get sick, then so can elderly and the immunocompromised. And so that's the big concern we're seeing across the board, Andrew.
Up next on Today As It Happened.
We're going to get along good with China. I hear so many stories about we're not going to allow their students, or we're going to allow their students to come in. We're going to allow, it's very important, 600,000 students. It's very important.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. I'm Liz Landers. Let's jump right back into our rundown of our top stories of the day.
The Trump administration says it will appeal a federal judge's decision to reverse the cuts it made to Harvard University. The judge says it was illegal for the administration to block $2 billion in federal funding for cancer research earlier this year. The cuts happened after the administration accused the university of failing to address anti-Semitism on its campus. The judge called that accusation a smokescreen for a targeted, ideological, motivated response. Harvard sued the government for violating the First Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. And last month, the State Department said more than 6,000 foreign students have had their visas revoked since President Trump took office. The administration says it's done so because students are breaking the law or for national security reasons. And some of these students are challenging these decisions in court. Let's bring in our national correspondent, Alex Miller. She is live in New York with more of the details. And Alex, the administration has been all over the map on this issue, including getting some very real backlash from ardent supporters.
Yeah, Andrew, the backlash has been swift, and the Trump administration trying to cover up that backlash also swift. This comes after President Trump said last week that having Chinese students in the United States is an important thing. Listen.
We're going to get along good with China. I hear so many stories about we're not going to allow their students, or we're going to allow their students to come in. We're going to allow, it's very important, 600,000 students. It's very important. But we're going to get along with China. But it's a different relationship that we have now with China.
Now, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick backed him up on this, saying that the bottom 15% of colleges and universities would close without foreign students, but that was not enough for some of Trump's base, including Laura Loomer, including Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who spoke out on this, saying essentially that they're frustrated by this. They do not support these kinds of comments, but the administration is trying, it looks, to appease that part of their base a little bit, talking about creating a new rule under the Department of Homeland Security, aiming to limit the length of time that certain visa holders, including foreign students, are allowed to stay in the United States. They want to limit that to 4 years. The Department of Homeland Security writing that for too long, past administrations have allowed foreign students and other visa holders to remain in the U.S. indefinitely. They say it poses safety risks, costs an untold amount of taxpayer dollars, and they also say it disadvantages U.S. citizens. They say since 1978, some of these visa holders have been able to stay in the United States for an indefinite amount of time. Now, Andrew, these students are allowed to apply for extensions to their visas, but experts say that this could create a backlog, and of course that backlog might not be in the exact timing with a school calendar.
And Alex, I know there's a separate suit coming out of Stanford University you've been following. What are the students there alleging?
Yeah, they are specifically suing Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. They say that they are using their powers to deport students that they don't agree with in terms of their speech. We've seen this all across the country. This one coming out of Stanford University. Some students, but mostly focused on their independent student newspaper. I want to read you a little piece from this lawsuit. They say that students are self-censoring and that they have even declined assignments relating to the war in Gaza because they are worried about what could happen. I spoke with the lead lawyer on this lawsuit, Connor Fitzpatrick, about this. Listen to what he had to say. By the way, the organization that Fitzpatrick works for has supported the Trump administration in other speech controversies. This one, they are taking the opposition view.
The Trump administration likes to talk the talk when it comes to free speech, but they aren't walking the walk. At every turn, they are trying to retaliate against people who are voicing views that this administration doesn't like. It only takes a few to install the chill and fear over millions. What we are seeing across the country, not only in university students and university faculty, but non-citizens across the board, is fear and a decision that they're just going to stay silent, and they are not going to risk criticizing the government or the Trump administration for fear that they might be thrown out of the country.
And Andrew, part of the issue here is that the administration is doing this without much notice, and as the school year gets underway, this creates a lot of issues for students. That case will be heard by a judge on November 19th, but this is an American problem right now, but there's also issues in other countries, including the UK, who says that they have students overstaying their visas as well. They're threatening to remove those students, and some of those students, the government says, are now applying for asylum, though nothing has changed in their home countries.
Okay, interesting context there. National correspondent Alex Miller for us in New York. Alex, thank you. In a significant shift in America's war on drugs, President Trump says he ordered the U.S. military to strike an alleged drug boat tied to a Venezuelan cartel, killing 11. The U.S. has designated the Tren de Aragua a narco-terrorist group and alleges cartels in Venezuela are operating under control of the country's president, Nicolas Maduro. Scripps News national security correspondent Liz Landers is on the story. And Liz, what are the international legal concerns about this strike?
Yeah, this is just another example of the Trump administration escalating their attacks against cartels. And there are now mounting legal questions from both international and domestic critics about the legality of the United States' recent actions in the Caribbean. So President Trump announced earlier this week that the U.S. had carried out that strike. It had killed 11 people in a boat in the southern Caribbean, and it was allegedly operated by the gang Tren de Aragua. The president also shared video, we're showing it right there, of the moment when this boat was struck. He shared this on his social media channels. He claimed that the vessel was transporting, quote, illegal narcotics headed to the United States, and emphasized that the so-called terrorists were in international waters. The administration has designated cartels like Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations back in February, which gives them more room to sanction and restrict them, at least financially. Now, though, the New York Times is reporting additional details that Pentagon officials were still working late Wednesday on a legal rationale to share with the public to justify these strikes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Trump have both justified the maritime attack by saying the strike sends an unmistakable message to drug cartels. And the president told reporters in the Oval Office Wednesday that the other drug smugglers are going to see this video and say, let's not do this. So he says it's going to be a deterrent. So to get more clarity on all this, I spoke with Kevin John Heller. He is a professor of international law and security at the University of Copenhagen Center for Military Studies. He said he was initially shocked to see the news and believes it is an internationally unlawful attack. Listen to what he told me.
In the context of international human rights law, as I said, it is not always unlawful to kill someone, but it does have to be, the killing, both proportionate and necessary. A killing is proportionate really only when the person who is killed is posing an imminent threat to human life. And that was clearly not the case here. So right there, it's a violation of international human rights law. But even if somehow the United States had the right to use lethal force against these particular drug traffickers, that killing also has to be necessary. And what that means is it has to be a last resort. It has to be the only potential option, the only way to avoid the person who is being killed from using lethal force against some innocent person. And we have the statement from Marco Rubio that explicitly says they didn't even try to interdict the boat. They didn't try anything other than just blowing them out of the water, as he said, to send a message to drug traffickers. That is essentially an admission that this is not a killing that is consistent with international human rights law.
Heller pointed out that this action was a break from previous administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that would interdict and apprehend drug dealers on the high seas. And he added that international human rights law doesn't allow you to send a message to people who you think are bad guys. Andrew?
So, Liz, domestically speaking, how does this stand up under U.S. law?
Well, Andrew, I spoke yesterday with a former national security official who also believes that this administration is on questionable legal ground from a domestic perspective, too, saying that a domestic basis for this kind of action could be things like self-defense in response to an imminent attack or a threat of an imminent attack or an authorization from Congress. One example that this person provided was that when the U.S. engages in lethal action against terrorists overseas, that is generally justified under the 2001 authorization to use military force, which has been interpreted to provide the domestic legal justification for those kinds of attacks against al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. But in this case, this former national security official was saying that there's no equivalent domestic authority here, and that usually, Andrew, drug trafficking is addressed through criminal laws, not through these sort of one-off strikes. And again, it may not be a one-off strike. The president and Secretary of State indicating this may become a pattern. Andrew? We'll be right back to continue our rundown of today's top stories on Today as It Happened.
Well, it's been 3 weeks since President Trump met with Vladimir Putin in Alaska amid hopes for a breakthrough on Ukraine. Today, the international community convened in Paris under the Coalition of the Willing, with 26 countries pledging to bolster Ukraine's security post-conflict. Scripps News international correspondent Jason Bellini joins us now live from Washington. And Jason, Given that last month's Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska looked promising, at least on paper, what's the state of play now, especially after today's talks in Paris?
Hi, Andrew. Well, the state of play, it includes a surge in Russian attacks in the last few weeks since that summit. The attacks have actually nearly doubled in terms of the number of missiles and drones that Putin's been attacking targets. The Ukrainians say it's almost entirely civilian targets that they're hitting. In fact, we have a new emblem of the cruelty of these attacks in a 2-year-old girl and her mother who just a week ago were killed in an attack on Kyiv that killed 23 people. So it has just been unrelenting there. Now, as far as what came out of that Alaska summit, remember, there was no ceasefire. That was the main goal. There was no ceasefire agreed to. And you also had Trump saying afterward that Ukraine would have to cede territory, which you have Zelensky flat out rejecting. And so that hasn't even been discussed much in the week since then. The other thing I think it's worth noting is that Trump seemed increasingly angry with Russia, especially the last few days. And in fact, there was a call today between Trump and European leaders in which he, according to White House officials who shared this information with Scripps News, in which he encouraged European leaders to put economic pressure on Russia by not buying their oil anymore. So that's quite a change in tone from the president from just a few weeks ago, Andrew.
So, Jason, how is the U.S. positioning itself? Does Trump's phone call today with Zelensky and those other European leaders suggest some renewed engagement on the side of the U.S., or is there something else at play here?
It does appear that the U.S. is now more open to the security guarantees that the Europeans are taking the lead in putting into place. Now, remember that Putin would have to agree to these, and that's unlikely. The Kremlin has made it very clear they don't want to see European troops on the ground, that they would be highly averse to any type of security arrangements that involved European troops, not under the banner of NATO, but European troops on the border with Russia. That said, Macron said that he expects for Trump to clarify in the next few days what role the U.S. will play. And the Europeans and President Zelensky have been very clear that, yes, it's great that you've got 26 European countries that are all coming together in this coalition of the willing, but without the United States, it's a paper tiger. The thing I think is worth pointing out is that we're now approaching the 2-week deadline that Trump set for Putin to get engaged and to show that he is sincere in his interest in negotiating for peace. Well, that's coming up this week. What will happen should he miss that deadline? Should Putin miss that deadline? One thing that we're hearing more and more discussion about are sanctions, serious sanctions in coordination between the U.S. and European allies, Andrew.
Thank you for joining us this evening for Today As It Happened. I'm Liz Landers. Have a great Thursday night.